So our next presenter is Kelly Curtis. So Kelly's going to be talking about effects of exposure to death and dying on belief systems.
Hi, everyone. I am excited to be presenting my PhD project that I'm currently working on about effects of exposure to death and dying on belief systems. So I'm Kelly Curtis. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm being supervised by Neil Dagnall and Ken Drinkwater, who some of you might know or know their research. My background is in psychology, mental health counseling, as well as paranormal investigation. So I'm going to give you a brief recap of my research project, give you some findings that I've found at this point in time, and then talk about what's next with my research project. So I am really interested in how exposure to death and dying affects people's beliefs on an individual basis. This is a somewhat underexplored area. A lot of the research that's out there looks into the experience of those who are dying themselves, the bereaved, and cultural customs around death, but nobody's really zoomed out and looked at all different types of exposure to death and dying, compared them, contrasted them, to see how different types of exposure to death and dying affects people. And there's also, I was surprised when I started my PhD project, there's really no standard measure for exposure to death and dying. Everybody who does this type of research is kind of doing their own thing, flying by the seat of their pants, creating their own measures on the whim. So I really am focused on creating a standard measure that looks at all types of exposure to death and dying, because with that, we can really start to replicate some of these findings, and we can also see how they compare to different belief systems, views on death and dying, such as death anxiety, paranormal belief in the afterlife, religiosity. With a standardized measure, we can look at these more in depth and more uniformly. For me in this project, people with high exposures to all sorts of death and dying are of particular interest, because the differences that show up between people with high exposure and low exposure can really shed some light on how beliefs are formed, how they're upheld, and particularly with my mental health background, I'm curious about the mental health needs of people who have different types of exposure to death and dying, and how those support systems might need to look a little bit different depending on what type of exposure people have received. So when it comes to exposure to death and dying, I've discovered 4 limitations in the research that's out there already. One, some people look at exposure to death, meaning after the point of death, or exposure to dying, meaning someone's experience leading up to dying, but not both. They kind of keep them separate in a lot of the research. The second limitation I've found is kind of categorizing them and keeping them separate. So looking at exposure in professional sphere, in personal relationships, or in one's own experience of death and dying, but they're not really looking at all of these areas at once, zooming out and looking at them as a whole. The third limitation I've found in previous research is researchers really just kind of having ill-defined participant reports. So they might have a prompt in a questionnaire that just says, how often have you been exposed to death? And they give a 1 to 5 scale, and that really doesn't shed a light on the specifics of what type of exposure to death and dying these people might have received. Also, relying on a lot of assumptions. For example, there was a study done in India where they pulled all of the nurses from a hospital, and they just assumed that all of the nurses had the same type of exposure to death and dying at the same levels of exposure, which wouldn't necessarily be the case depending on the type of nurse, how long they've been in the profession, etc. So what I'm hoping to do is first and foremost create a comprehensive measure for exposure to death and dying. This has already been done in my research at this point in time. I've categorized it into 6 different subcategories. So professional exposure to death, professional exposure to dying, exposure to death in personal relationships, exposure to dying in personal relationships, and then exposure to one's own death and exposure to one's own dying. I conclude that these 6 categories are going to have different effects depending on how much and at what specific types of exposure people are receiving. I am using a 5-point scale for this, and each category has 4 prompts, and each prompt is a different type of exposure to death or dying. So for example, exposure to death in the professional sphere, the prompt might be, how often in your professional life have you been exposed to preparing a body after death, for example, as a prompt. Then I'm going to compare, this is where I'm at number 2 in my current spot in my research study. I'm comparing these different types of exposure with views about death and dying, death anxiety, fear of death, and different death attitudes. Then after that, I'm going to compare these types of exposure to death and dying with belief systems. So paranormal belief, religiosity, types of believers, belief in the afterlife, to kind of get a picture about how exposure to death and dying might be related to more paranormal beliefs. And then my third part of my project, I'm going to transition into a qualitative interview-based part of my research to really kind of dive into more individual differences, what might be leading to some of these beliefs, what might change over time, is more time in a profession going to alter people's beliefs, that type of thing. So I'll really get more into individual differences. So here's some interesting findings that I have found at this point in time, where I have, at this point, looked at exposure to death and dying with views about death. I had all the participants fill out my exposure to death and dying questionnaire, and then they also filled out the death anxiety scale, the fear of death scale, and the death attitudes profile, which you'll see on the next slide. So in general, basically, the more exposure you get to death or dying, no matter what kind, you have an increased positive outlook about death and dying, and a decreased negative outlook. That's kind of the general zoomed out snapshot. When we look specifically at the death anxiety scale, overall exposure, if you take the total score of exposure to death and dying across all 6 of those categories, you get a negative correlation with death anxiety. So death anxiety goes down as exposure to death and dying goes up. More specifically, within the categories, professional exposure to both death and dying and exposure in personal relationships also have a really significant negative correlation. What's slightly different is when we look at exposure to one's own death and dying. There was a negative correlation when it came to exposure to one's own death, but it wasn't very significant, so there was just a little correlation between exposure to my own death, and for example, one of those prompts was like being resuscitated, for example, and death anxiety, little correlation. What's interesting is when we look at exposure to my own dying, so for example, one of the prompts there is being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. There's switches to a slight positive correlation. So there's tending to be some sort of difference here between exposure between death and dying when it comes to my own experience with death and dying. Now, when we look at the fear of death scale, the fear of death scale separates fear of death into 4 categories: fear of my own death, fear of my own dying, fear of others' death, or fear of others dying. So again, overall exposure, less fear about death in all 4 of those categories, no matter what type of exposure when you're looking at the total. And similarly, when we look at some of these specific categories, professional exposure and exposure in personal relationships to both death and dying relate in a negative correlation with fear of other people's death, fear of other people's dying, and with my own death. So if I'm exposed to death and dying outside of myself, I have less fear about other people dying and my own death. However, it flips again when we look at our own dying. Suddenly there's a positive correlation there. And there wasn't any sort of significant correlation between exposure to my own death and dying, except between, again, my own dying. There's a slight positive correlation between exposure to my own dying and fear of my own dying, which doesn't show up in any other relationship. Now, when we look at the death attitudes profile, some other interesting things come out. The death attitudes profile separates death attitudes into 5 areas. You have their own fear of death category. They have death avoidance, which means I do not want to talk or think about death or dying at all. Approach acceptance, which death means, oh, a happy afterlife. I have escape acceptance, which means death relates to the end of life suffering. Or I have neutral acceptance, which is the thought that death is a natural thing. It's neither positive nor negative. I'm neutral about it. So when we look at these 5 categories and exposure to death and dying, both in fear of death and death avoidance, there's a significant negative correlation amongst all types of exposure to death and dying. So the more exposure I have, the less fear of death I have, and the more I'm willing to talk about it, basically. Approach acceptance is a little bit different. Death is a happy afterlife. There's a positive correlation with the professional exposures and exposures in personal relationships. However, not in, again, my own death or dying. It's not a significant correlation there. Now, escape acceptance and neutral acceptance are very unique. There's only a positive correlation there when it comes to exposure to my own death and dying. The only groups that had a positive correlation there were exposure to my own death and dying. So the more exposure I have to that area, my own, the more I see death as the end of life suffering, and it's neutral. I wanted to just highlight this a little bit differently because I know there's a lot of people here who research like near-death experiences of my own death and dying. So you'll see here significant negative correlation with fear of death, death avoidance. There was a positive correlation with approach acceptance, but it was insignificant. And then we have these 2 outliers, escape acceptance and neutral acceptance. No other type of exposure had a significant correlation with those views on death. What's also particularly interesting is when I isolate near-death experience, it only shows a significant correlation with neutral acceptance, which was a little surprising for me. I would expect people who have had a near-death experience to have some sort of strong opinion about it, positive or negative, but they're the group that has what they most correlate with is a neutrality about it. Very interesting. So next, I'm going to take these, exposure to death and dying scale, and I'm going to start correlating it with paranormal belief, religiosity, subjective paranormal experiences, different types of believers, whether they're just a believer or they participate in their beliefs in some way, and see how those numbers break out. And then in phase 3, I'm going to go qualitative. I'm going to interview people, see how death attitudes are formed, beliefs around death, if they change over time with exposure to death and dying or not. And then also look into those mental health needs. What type of support are you getting? Has it been effective for various types of death and dying? So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kelly. We're actually at 1 minute, under 1 minute left. So unfortunately, I don't know if we've got time for proper questions, but hopefully we'll have time to pester you at the banquet tonight if anyone has any pressing questions for Kelly. But thank you. I thought that was fascinating. And this is your doctoral work, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Wow, it's fascinating.
Thank you.